Welcome, viewers, to the Inside Interviews podcast, which is an enlightening series of academic discussions where we take a deeper dive on a variety of unique topics. After the episode, be sure to check out our previous ones on our website, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Today, we are honored to have our guest with us at the Shia Research Institute podcast. We have Muhammad Omar Faruque, is the Inayat Malik Assistant Professor and a Taft Center Fellow at the University of Cincinnati and a visiting scholar at Harvard University. His award-winning book, Sculpting the Self, University of Michigan Press 2021, addresses what it means to be human in a secular post-Enlightenment world by exploring notions of selfhood and subjectivity in Islamic and non-Islamic philosophical literatures, including modern philosophy and neuroscience. He's the author of 3 books and over 50 academic articles which have appeared or are forthcoming in numerous leading peer-reviewed journals and edited volumes such as Sophia, Philosophy East and West, Arabic Sciences, and Philosophy at Cambridge, Journal of Sufi Studies, Religious Studies, the Oxford Handbook of Islamic Ethics and Ancient Philosophy. He has delivered lectures in many North American, European, Asian, and Middle Eastern universities. He is also the recipient of numerous awards and fellowships, including the prestigious Templeton Foundation Global Philosophy of Religion grant and the Title IV grant from the U.S. Department of Education. The subject of Dr. Faruque's book on the self, entitled Sculpting the Self, Islam, Selfhood, and Human Flourishing, is a subject that I myself have been keenly occupied with over the years. For me personally, ever since I read Charles Taylor's work, Sources of the Self. And in general, I became acquainted with Charles Taylor through my professor during my undergraduate days, Professor Todd Lawson, in a class on Sufism, interestingly. Perhaps that's something we can discuss later. It is essentially an exercise in understanding how we understand ourselves, what do we mean, where has our self-awareness come from, and what does it entail? What is its underlying history? It is so intimately connected to a host of concerns, namely who gave it existence and how does it operate? This seems to be a question of perennial concern, but also a site of tension and dialogue, especially in the modern secular age, and the language of inwardness, to borrow the phrase from Charles Taylor. So Dr. Faruque's book, Sculpting the Self, is not only immensely informative, but very timely, and certainly demonstrates a vast breadth of knowledge drawn from various sources, both Eastern and Western, both pre-modern and modern, ranging from European, Middle Eastern, and South Asian languages. Dr. Faruque, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, Dr. Vinay, and thank you for inviting me to have this interview.
Let's get right into today's discussion. As I was reading this book, it was like my mind I'm used to reading a traditional, let's say, text in Islamic intellectual history, but this is not exactly that. This is, as I said, East and West. You're bringing sources from Bain al-Mashriq wal-Maghrib. And tell us a little bit about your academic journey to be able to, especially for students that may be listening, graduate students, other people, how did you come across dealing with so many sources? So what was your academic journey? Tell us a little bit about that to arrive at writing such a book.
Right. So I think this is a very important question because, as some medieval philosopher has stated, the self is the knot of the universe. It's really the knot that holds together what it means to be human, whether there's any prospect of meaning in human life, and whether the world is intelligible to us, whether there's meaning in the external reality, in the cosmos, in the universe. And the key to all of these questions, all of these issues is the self. But unfortunately, when it comes to our universities, I would say both in the West as well as the rest of the world, due to the post-colonial situation, we tend to compartmentalize things. We tend to we tend to divide disciplines. We tend to have disciplines focusing on very specific topics, and even when it comes to a single topic, let's say the topic of the self, we approach it, from different angles, and in the process, we tend to lose sight of the big picture. So imagine you intend to study the self, because this should be something perhaps natural to most of us, because we want to know as human beings who we are, beneath the surface, beneath the appearance of things. But if we want to approach the self from the perspective of anthropology, semiotics and sign, the relationship between sign, signifier, and signified, and then studying the theories of Lacan, Foucault, and many others, you get a different picture of the self that you'd not encountered if you had approached the same topic from let's say, a purely scientific discipline such as neuroscience, or what's called neuroscience of consciousness. There, you would only focus on what I call the biophysiological dimension of the self. So you have multiple definitions coming out from that particular discipline. And one of the famous neuroscientists, namely Antonio Damasio, defines the neuroscientific conception of the self as something that is perpetually recreated through neurobiological states. So that's a statement that bears very little relation with how we tend to see the self through the lens of anthropology, for example. And then, excuse me, we move on to other disciplines. We move on to phenomenology, perhaps sociology, and religious studies, and so on and so forth. And we get kind of partial images, partial pictures of the self. And I use the analogy of the blindfolded people, trying to determine what is an elephant in a room. So when it comes to the study of the self, that's the picture where we're left with. Everyone is giving us partial information, but it's partial and it's not fulfilling in the end. And this is so important because it's not just with respect to self. It's actually, you can have say this of so many other important fields of inquiry across the sciences and the humanities. So this is really sad, and it's actually very important to kind of note at the very beginning, because those are the challenges I was facing, and I was thinking, there must be a way to kind of overcome this. So, of course, when you're in academia, you have to approach things from an academic perspective. You need to have a methodology, framework. So I was trying to collect as many data points as possible, trying to look at it from any and every perspective, be it science or humanities, or in academia or outside of academia, because this is for me, that was a kind of really existential issue. So ever since I came of age at 13, I had been thinking about who am I, and like what gives meaning to my life, those questions. And at this point in my life, after nearly 2 decades, I could say that it is something where academic viewpoints, academic approaches certainly do help. Learning different languages, learning it from the perspective of Chinese philosophy, as well as Islamic philosophy, and then also the sciences. But if one is really, really inquiring about who they are, then one has to also travel sort of outside. One has to kind of explore things, in the outside world, outside of academia, meaning travel to different parts of the world, meeting with people whom one might think may have deep self-knowledge. So it's one thing to learn a theory of the self from a given Western or even non-Western philosopher, but it's quite another to meet a person who embodies a really deeper dimension of what it means to be a self, something profound. And it's not just wise people, but even ordinary people can teach us something really sometimes deep and subtle about human nature. So I tried to sort of combine all of these perspectives because, as I say, for me, this was an existential issue. So it was obviously extremely challenging because if I wanted to just follow the rule and just kind of write a dissertation on the self from the perspective of Islamic intellectual history. There is a given methodology, or Islamic philosophy for that matter. There is a given methodology. You limit yourself to given thinker, you make use of translated passages, and then you come out with a kind of standard interpretation of what's on. But that was not what I was looking for. For me, the overarching question was already what it means to be human, not just in any context, but in our own particular complex context, namely the post-Enlightenment world, the secular globalized world in which we live. So it has all of its complexities, problems, and challenges. So it is still a challenge. Like, to talk about ourselves, I think that of all the scientific and philosophical inquiries, this one is perhaps the most complicated of all, namely the human nature, because we can never exhaust this issue from the perspective of empirical sciences alone, whether the self is material or immaterial. We can always come up with kind of facile definitions, such as, oh, human beings are biological machines, as we hear often, the kind of the physicists telling us. On the other hand, there are postmodernist understanding of the self saying, there's no intrinsic human nature, and that leads to also the debates about identity, class, gender, etc. So it is going to remain a contested topic, but this is something everyone has to encounter actually in some way or another. So this book is a humble effort to kind of come to terms with that topic.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is humbling, I would say, to read it, because it's just so much to process. And look, even saying process, is it myself processing it, my brain? I mean, it's such an interesting discussion, and I'd like us to get into the title here, because I always like to understand the title of the book. What's the connection between the self and fulfilling and a fulfilling life? Like, I see this connection here, right? You have the self on one hand, and you have selfhood or human flourishing. I like the very last word, human flourishing. I would like to understand why you chose that title. The connection between human flourishing and the self. Could you just shed a little bit of light on that? Why you chose that word? Yeah.
Right. So sculpting the self, that particular phrase comes from from Plotinus, the Greek philosopher Plotinus, who incidentally was also extremely influential in the Islamic tradition, although many Islamic philosophers mistook him for Aristotle. But anyway, in the Enneads, there's a very famous passage about sculpting the self. So it's a kind of play on that phrase. I think it's very symbolic, because when it comes to, so if we actually analyze the phrase sculpting the self, we already get to the point why it's deeply connected to human flourishing. So just imagine you want to sculpt a statue, an unformed statue, and you want to make a very beautiful image to give it a meaning, because an unformed statue is kind of just an unformed body of mass, and it's kind of meaningless. It's not as yet a beautiful figure of, let's say, Plato or some Greek god, or you can have statues in the Islamic world as well as some Avicenna, some famous figure. So a statue of Avicenna, the most influential Islamic philosopher, Ibn Sina, it's something meaningful to people, right? But just an unformed mass of stone is meaningless. The same is the case with ourselves. Except that we don't notice it. If we continue to live our life as though what I call the ordinary situation, ordinary human situation involving the ordinary conception, sense of the self, this is like the situation where we are preserving, we are in our kind of the unformed statue of the self. Like, we're not doing anything to the self so that it will ultimately give a meaningful feature. And so the point with sculpting is, just like sculpting a statue, is to kind of give it a meaningful form. And that form itself would lead to human flourishing or happiness of some sort. And this can be done in a number of ways, but practically one has to question one's ordinary condition. One has to ask whether the ordinary situation in which we find ourselves in, with all our negative emotions, desires. Sometimes we get very tired of ourselves. Sometimes we feel like we need anger management. Let's say it's a common example. But if we don't do anything about it, and then we're going to continue to sort of face problems, suffer in life, so to speak, and that's a direct impediment to human, happiness, flourishing, satisfaction, whichever way you want to talk about it. So when we are talking about the self, there are actually two questions: one descriptive, one normative, and that leads to, if you have a chance, we'll talk about my humble theory called the spectrum theory. But when it comes to the self, unlike the stone, unlike any other scientific objective inquiry, there are two interwoven questions. One is, what is the self? And another is, what it means to be a self. So one can talk about the self, describe it from the perspective of anthropology, sociology, and neurobiology. But that does not still answer what it means to be a self, what it means to live a fulfilling life. So that you'll have to address that question.
Got it. Yeah, exactly. And is bringing us to the earlier period. I again picked up on this theme as I read through the book. Pre-modern writers who discuss this concept of the self presuppose the existence of consciousness. So there's this presupposition that if you're conscious of yourself, you're conscious that you exist, that indicates that there is a self, that there's a link between consciousness and the self, or the very act of thinking is connected to both consciousness and the self. So basically, can you just maybe shed a little bit of light on the pre-modern conception of certain presuppositions and assumptions of the pre-modern writers, or we would say, both, and I would say perhaps both Greek and Muslim, or maybe even South Asian on that matter, that there's a connection between being self-aware of your own existence and this idea and definition of the self.
Right, that's a very interesting question again. But I would say that, first of all, I prefer to use the word non-modern, because pre-modern already seems to indicate some sort of kind of lower epistemic status vis-a-vis the modern. So I use the word non-modern. And as some people have pointed out, modernity sort of not just colonizes the space, but also colonizes time, because as soon as we say pre-modern, we feel like it's kind of out of sync with, something important. But anyway, non-modern thinkers, when they're talking, I would say that they don't necessarily frame the relationship between consciousness and thinking and existence in the way that became fashion after Descartes, the 17th century French philosopher Descartes. So we are familiar with Descartes, and in my book I discuss him vis-a-vis Mulla Sadra, and I argue against Cartesian dualism. So Descartes sort of comes up with the conclusion that I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, in Latin, trying to infer his existence, his individual existence, from thinking, and defining the self in terms of res cogitans, or pure thinking. These are all very problematic, and today, the Western world, as well as, I guess, educated public around the world, we more or less, even though we don't like to accept it, we have accepted this dualism of mind and matter, and we have managed to banish any notion of consciousness self from the material realm. That's why sciences are so prevalent, and if anything seems out of sync, out of line with the usual scientific empiricism, such as consciousness, we think that it must be an epiphenomenon. It must be a product of some mysterious physical process in the brain or in other places that we do not yet know. But that way of looking at things is actually very problematic. It's laden with a lot of kind of assumptions that people don't question. In the Islamic tradition, when it comes to philosophers like Avicenna, Suhrawardi, and Mulla Sadra, and others, especially, let's say I want to talk, confine myself to Suhrawardi. His starting point is also consciousness and the self, but he's not thinking in Cartesian terms, like trying to, infer existence, because this in existence of his own self from think. because this is already so self-evident. So we have to understand skepticism, the famous Cartesian doubts about whether I'm living in a simulation, to use a modern term, or there is an evil genie, like deceiving me, like as in a matrix. Those are never fashionable, as far as I know, both in the Islamic world and in the Greek world, and also in other parts of the world. There are always few skeptics, but by and large, I mean, this is so self-evident, because I give public talks to people who are not academics but who are interested, and whenever I tend to mention this kind of philosophical, like thought experiments, like what Descartes was trying to do, people start laughing. Just imagine you're having a meeting at the UN Security Council, something very serious. And recently we have been, there are many such meetings, right? Because something important is at stake. And suddenly someone is saying, what if everything that we're discussing, everything we're talking, maybe it's a simulation, maybe there's a genie, evil genie kind of deceiving us. No, everybody would just, I guess, give you a stare and think, perhaps you came from a different planet, something like that. So I think, this is, I mean, it's interesting when we, as philosophy students, for example, when we read something like Brains in a VAD, those kind of articles, it's something to fiddle with, perhaps play with. But I personally don't take it seriously, and most most influential philosophers of the 20th century, everyone sort of made an effort to kind of reject Cartesianism one way or another. But then it's a kind of, you're wasting your time on something that is already so self-evident. So in the Islamic tradition, consciousness is not to be the everyday experience of reality, in the sense that we exist. There's an external world and there's an interrelationship between the knower and the knower. These things are not kind of doubted, but that does not mean that we already know the nature of consciousness and we already know the relationship between thinking and consciousness. No, those are issues that still need to be kind of explained. So consciousness is something way more fundamental than even thinking, something Descartes does not realize. So in my book, I don't want to get into all the kind of philosophical details and arguments, but I'll just try to be brief. I talk about different modalities of consciousness, like reflective, non-reflective, and intersubjective. So when we do philosophical thinking, we are kind of turning our gaze onto ourselves. We are kind of in a reflective process of thinking about the world, thinking about ourselves. That's the very definition of reflexivity. But there's another form of consciousness that is even more fundamental, and that I argue actually as something that grounds reflexivity, which is non-reflective. And I give several examples going back to Suhrawardi and others. But fundamentally, this is the idea that if we want to ascertain, who we are at the most foundational level, our base, our self-knowledge of who, I am, then we can never do so through reflection. And so Cartesian thinking will always run in a circle. I just don't want to go into the details of the arguments, but we have to ground ourselves in a non-reflective form of consciousness. And then from there, we realize that reflexivity is part of that. So one quick example, before I even have the thought of I am thinking, before I even have the notion of I consciousness, like as someone sitting here, and I use the word I to refer to myself, consciousness already exists. Like consciousness does not come into being as soon as I utter the word I. I mean, that seems to be the thinking of most contemporary philosophers as well as scientists. Yes. But that is so blatantly false. Think about the state of deep sleep, or a state where you are not reflectively aware of yourself. But there was always consciousness in the background, except that you did not start the process of thinking yet. So consciousness is a multimodal phenomenon. It's a process. If you like, you can think about it in terms of a stream that always runs, never absent, as Suhrawardi would say. But it's not just reflexivity, which is associated with thinking. There is a mode of consciousness that's prior, more fundamental, which I call non-reflective, and which has all sorts of implications. And in modern times, just a quick word, in modern times, many philosophers studying with the phenomenological tradition, Husserl, Heidegger, even Sartre, and others, they talk about pre-reflective consciousness because they want to avoid Cartesian dualism. That's a form of non-reflective consciousness, but it's much more than that.
And this brings us to something that's just so much to discuss about this, which is in the Islamic instance, and I would say Abrahamic as well, and I don't know enough about the South Asian traditions on that in that regard, but I would assume for some of them, this is a metaphysical concept. This is something that outlives the physical. This is something that transcends that. This is something that is both dunyawi and ukhrawi, right? It's both worldly and otherworldly, right? And that concept of consciousness is linked to selfhood. Selfhood is linked to consciousness. It's almost as if they're, don't know, maybe two sides of the same coin or two faces of the same reality, or two words to indicate one kind of central unifying reality. But for non-theists, this may not be the case, is it? For people like Camus or Sartre, these existentialists, this clearly wasn't the case for them. So, and I like how you draw that distinction in the book. You have quite a long footnote about this, and I really liked it. Can you just give us just a brief kind of distinction between theist and non-theist approaches to what you've just mentioned?
Sure.
I think non-theists would not agree with a lot of what of what is mentioned by theists.
Right. Well, in the book, I don't discuss this issue in terms of metaphysics or in terms of theism and non-theism, because I want to limit myself to phenomenological investigation, which would be which is a kind of neutral venue for theist, non-theist, atheist, agnostic, Islamic, non-Islamic. And I claim that you can still derive a very meaningful notion of human flourishing and concept of the self. So I'm trying, there are several goals in the body in the book. I'm trying to develop a new framework, a global framework to study the self across time, across tradition. It's a very ambitious project from that perspective. But on the other hand, I'm also, because it's a normative, its normativity is laden with the idea of the self, I'm also providing a normative conception of the self. So people like Camus and Sartre would agree with me as far as I'm talking about purely the descriptive level of the self. For me, those are three: biophysiological, sociocultural, and cognitive experiential. I'm just describing what appears in our experience and in our refined experience, which we can make use of empirical tools. So Sartre actually figures quite a bit. Camus, not so much, but I've taught philosophy courses on existentialism, so I discuss these authors quite often. So Camus and Sartre, we have to see that they come from first of all, to understand them, we have to understand the kind of very, the kind of complicated history of the last few hundred years and the scientific revolution, enlightenment, and secularization, and ultimately in this a situation where you felt like there's no way you can go back to traditional notions of God, and you cannot explain meaning in relation to religion. And for a lot of these people, it's still, I guess, it's the case, that door has been closed through all sorts of enlightenment critiques of tradition, authority, and religious beliefs. So their starting point is the meaninglessness of the cosmos, meaninglessness of the universe. Unlike the traditional idea where if someone comes from a theistic background, there's meaning in our life, there's meaning in the world because there's a cause, there's a creator who created this for a purpose. But their starting point is the ultimate meaninglessness of the universe, coupled with the fact that leads to an alienation vis-a-vis nature, a lot of anguish and angst, because you are on your own. So Sartre would say that, well, actually, that's a very good situation in a way we can capitalize on, because we can then we are actually free. We are free from all the traditional notions of the self, spirit, whatever. There's no constraint, as he said famously. I forgot the French bit. I think he said something like human beings are condemned to freedom, something like that. So we are free because when it comes to the notion of the self, there is a kind of initial biological substratum, a parameter, like human beings are human beings. They have a given body and perceptual faculties. They are not elephants or dolphins. But beyond that, for Sartre, you are free to make whatever you want to make of yourself through a process of self-construction. So if you feel like you want to be XYZ in life, you want to do, and you want to develop a particular self-image of yourself in light of a given, let's say, Hollywood actor, actress, or a football player, whoever, a celebrity, or something unique. None of these examples. You're free to develop that self-image. You're free to construct a self out of yourself. So that seems to be his principal main claim. Whereas for Camus, it's more, it's different. He comes up with three options. When it comes to when you analyze the human condition in light of the ultimate meaninglessness, then you have three options. You have suicide, you have philosophical suicide, and you have what he calls l'absurde in French, the absurd. So suicide, he rules it out because it's, just as life is meaningless, death is also meaningless. So one is just being a coward if one is committing a suicide. Philosophical suicide is different. It's like trying to convince yourself that there is meaning in life through science, through religion, through whatever. And for him, again, that's a self-defeating process because there is no meaning in life. So what's the last option? Last option is accept the absurd. So he uses the famous myth of Sisyphus, like Sisyphus. So a ball. Those who are familiar with the Greek mythology, as we know, like imagine there's a huge rock on the incline of a mountain, and then a person, namely Sisyphus, is trying hard to push it upward, but then it's a huge rock, so heavy, so it rolls down. So he has to start from the beginning again and tries to roll the ball upward against the incline, and it continues forever because you're not able to succeed ultimately in fulfilling your goal, but you still accept the possibility of the meaninglessness, the absurd. But again, these are options that would not satisfy most people, I think. But yeah, that's how some existentialists will look at things. But nonetheless, they cannot deny that beyond these normative conceptions of what gives meaning in a meaninglessness situation, namely the absurd, or you should construct yourself and attain freedom. That's a normative conception. But and that's one possibility. Sartre or anybody else should be open to other options on the table. And beyond that, there might be, even on the descriptive level, there might be other dimensions of the self that might reveal something different about ourselves. And so here I would say that Islamic philosophers, they are doing both phenomenological kind of analysis, like the structure of the experience, but at the same time, there are normative claims about what it means to be a self, and which I get to in the last part of the book, like Sculpting the Self. So there will be fundamental disagreements with people like Sartre and Camus, but that does not mean every atheist, every agnostic philosopher would disagree with some of the proposals, because there are a lot of non-theistic or atheistic philosophers who are actually fine with something like compassion as a category that should be important when it comes to thinking about what it means to be a self. So the idea of compassion, spirituality, meditation, we can talk about them later, but these are not necessarily things that every single atheist philosopher would deny, given the prospect of human flourishing in the end.
So there is a kind of universal, I mean, this is what I particularly liked about your book. There's a kind of universal thread that runs amongst both those that would subscribe to organized religion and those that wouldn't, or those that would, I don't know, I guess subscribe to a traditional religious framework and those that wouldn't. I found that particularly interesting. It's not a question, just my own appreciation, my own comment.
Sure.
Which brings us to another question. It's great how this is flowing, but there's the metaphysical conception of the self and the phenomenological conception of the self. Sometimes these two can be conflated, but they're not necessarily the same, are they? Just to clarify for the
They're
listeners,
related,
those
yes.
of reading the book, because you do differentiate between these two.
I would say non-metaphysical. I would say phenomenological and normative, or in my terminology, descriptive and normative.
And normative, yeah,
So,
descriptive and normative conceptions of the self.
Yes.
And how these two are used, and then of course they're purely physiological. But the people that deny it,
that comes under descriptive.
Yeah, we're just nothing but a pack of neurons,
Yes.
right? That's all it is, right? There's nothing. There's nothing mysterious at all about it. Everything can be found basically under a microscope, and you can see it and know, what it is. Can you shed a little bit more light, just so we kind of understand the categories, how you differentiate them in the book? Right.
So there are some nice diagrams, I believe,
Yes.
so that are perhaps more helpful, but let me still try to describe. So there is the architectonic of the self. The self is analyzed in terms of a spectrum concept, which gets divided into descriptive level and normative level. And on the descriptive level, you have the biophysiological self, sociocultural self, the self that we analyze through sociology, anthropology. We talk about identity, collective identity, especially. That's the self, related to sociocultural self. And then the phenomenological conceptions, for me, the term is cognitive experiential, phenomenological and psychological. And then you also have the normative conceptions. It's a separate box now. Under normative, you have ethical and spiritual. We can also see the interrelationship through a concentric circle. So imagine you have 5 different concentric circles. The first circle, the innermost circle, contains the biophysiological self, and then another circle on top around it. Sociocultural self is something bigger, but it still contains biophysiological. And then you have cognitive experiential, because ultimately we are making sense of biophysiological and sociocultural through our experience, phenomenology. So that's even bigger. But then there are ethical and spiritual dimensions, which are containing the remaining dimensions. The spiritual and ethical dimensions are the dimensions through which we address the question of human flourishing, what it means to be a self. Religious conceptions of self, as well as philosophical, they would sometimes fall under ethical and spiritual. So sometimes philosophical conceptions such as human beings are defined as simply rational animals, according to Aristotle, or poetic animals, something like that. A famous biologist, Wilson, E.O. Wilson, I think, said something. And then our language, meaning-making animals. But then in religious Islamic conception, we also say to be a human being is to recover your fitra. There's an underlying primordial nature in which we had perfect knowledge of God, and we were kind of in a state of self-perfection. So the goal of life is to recover that state. That's a normative claim. Does not mean it's false, but it can be debated. But it's not like it is simply superimposed, because the self by nature is something we have to ask the question of, what it means to be a self. So you get all of these different options, and yeah.
Which brings us to one of the authors that you chose to study, which is, we'll go in order: Mulla Sadra, Shah Waliullah, and then Muhammad Iqbal. But let's start with Mulla Sadra. Why did you choose Mulla Sadra? Of course, everyone can go and read more in the book, but just for those who haven't yet read the book or will go and pick it up, tell us a little bit about Mulla Sadra and why you chose him as a representative, as a representative example, or as a case study, so to speak, for this work.
Sure. So this book is an attempt to bring together Western and non-Western philosophers, to put forth a new conception, a new theory of the self, namely the spectrum model. At the same time, I want to showcase the relevance of non-modern traditions, non-modern philosophers. And in the Islamic tradition, everyone has their own favorites. So I always had a fascination ever since my undergraduate days when I was an economics student. I actually came across a few books by Mulla Sadra, who is one of the most influential Shiite philosopher in the last few centuries, but also someone extremely open-minded, someone deeply engaging himself with the Greco-Roman traditions. And so I find his insights on the nature of the self really fascinating. And also he himself puts this question, namely the question of human nature, what is the self, what is the nature of this, what it means to be a self, at the center of his inquiry. It's very clear when you read the introduction to his magnum opus, Asfarul Arba'a, the Four Journeys, and also in other places. He comes back to the question of the self and self-knowledge. And this is not at all coincidental, because the Quran itself, uses the word self again and again. The word nafs,
all the
or a
time.
compound like nafsul ammara, nafsul mutma'inna, or ruh, words that point to the reality of the self, but from a different perspective. So this is a central topic, and religious traditions, at the risk of kind of simplifying, can be thought to, the religious traditions, in a way, they endeavor to respond to the question of what to make of the human condition. What are we supposed to do if we believe there's a creator created us? What are we supposed to do on earth? How are we supposed to value things, live our life, and what gives us satisfaction, rida, happiness, peace, fulfillment? These are abiding questions. I mean, this is a philosophical book, so I make use of a lot of terminologies, back and forth arguments. I engage with Kant, Hume, and others. But at the end of the day, these issues are not, they can be abstract, but then there are some people for whom that's the way you make sense of causality. But for other people, they're also addressing the same questions. Every single religious person thinks about what it means to be a good religious person. And so Mulla Sadra has to offer a lot to both philosophers as well as to ordinary believers. So I mean, when he talks about the relationship between, let's say, self-knowledge and ethics, he makes very clear. He gives examples, things like, he says, people who have good self-knowledge, they are usually very humble. They don't, instead of kind of faulting others, instead of backbiting, they always try to, you know, take the responsibility upon their own shoulders for themselves, and then try not to argue too much. Simple kind of ethical morals that people can follow. There are many such advice, and those ethical kind of guidelines, they follow from self-knowledge, like who you are, what are you supposed to do. So there are many other reasons. Of course, philosophical reasons. He addresses the question of consciousness head on. And he's someone who not only mastered philosophical sciences, but also wrote volumes on Shiite Hadith, Usulul Kafi, 4 volumes, 5 volumes,
Tafsir.
and Tafsir, and published, I think, in 9 volumes, or the different editions. He's drawing on the kind of spectrum of Islamic learning and trying to synthesize between philosophy, Sufism, or Irfan, and Quran, as well as kind of scientific inquiry, Burhan.
Which is so interesting. Coming back to this concept of consciousness, and I had not prepared this question, but I'm very interested now. And I remember you perhaps mentioning it in the book. What Arabic words did he use for consciousness, Mulla Sadra?
Right.
Wijdan, Dami. What was his choice?
Yes, so there's not, because it's
and self. So and the two coming together, because you do provide quite an inventory of.
Yes. So just like the case with English, when we say the self, we use the word self in everyday language. Everybody seems to have an, but there are many other similar related words that we also use, like ego, like person, like inner conscience, inner self, inwardness. These are all related terminology. They all refer to the reality of this. The same is the case in the Islamic tradition. That shows the richness and complexity of the topic, starting with the Quran. But for Mulla Sadra, the two main words are nafs and that. Both of them literally means the self, but especially the word nafs is used, and that's consistently going back to earlier philosophers. For consciousness, and of course, there are compound terminologies like, for self, like, so many different terminologies. But then for consciousness, there are, again, a number of words like shu'ur is used, but not so much. And then shu'ur be that used sometime, self-consciousness. At other times, it is discussed in relation to self-knowledge, in relation to thinking about ourselves. But I would say shu'ur and shu'ur bi that are the two words. But then what I was doing in the book is not just translating these terminologies and explaining what mullahs. I'm actually doing philosophy with this historical material. So when I say Mulla Sadra does have a notion of non-reflective consciousness, that's not a terminology you would find in the text, but that is coming out of the discussions, various arguments in the text. So from that perspective, it is perfectly justified. And as I show, like how he is talking about different modalities of consciousness.
Which brings us now to Shah Waliullah Dehlawi, right? The famous Indian scholar. Tell us a little bit about him and how he connects to mutual Sadra and mutual Shah Waliullah. What was his particular work? Did he have one particular work that he that stood out to you on this subject? And what was his contribution to this?
Right.
Yeah.
So again, all of these philosophers have really interesting stuff to say, but they would only make sense to us if we kind of look at it more constructively, philosophically, in light of our own predicaments. For example, everybody's talking about AI now. They're talking about whether machines are conscious, whether ChatGPT has become conscious. So this is a topic that everybody is thinking, whether we're Muslim or not. But I give a talk, I'm involved with the community, and I see there's a lot of interest, especially among young people, about these topics. So, but that's not an issue for Mulla Sadra or Shah Waliullah. But then they have a lot to say about the intricacies of consciousness and selfhood. So once we understood what they're saying, and then we can, if we're able to creatively relate to our own situation, then we realize how profound contribution they can make into our own problems and challenges, whether such as the question of whether computers can ever, ChatGPT, AI can ever become conscious or not. And also when it comes to, of course, the question of human flourishing, like everybody at some point in life, they think about the question of peace and inner equilibrium and those things. So Shah Waliullah, for me, so first of all, he was an 18th century Sufi philosopher, thinker. Like Mulla Sadra, he was also versed in different Islamic sciences, all the way from hadith to fiqh, usul al-fiqh, law and legal theory, and then also Sufism and what I would say philosophical Sufism. So he was not exactly a philosopher like Mulla Sadra, but he clearly read something from Mulla Sadra, something from the philosopher, because terminology is everywhere. And he, like Mulla Sadra, he's also trying to synthesize. He's drawing on the Stoics, the Greek tradition of the Stoics, and then the Sufi traditions where they talk about the subtle bodies. They talk about activating the subtle centers, subtle fields of consciousness within your body through yoga, like exercise, breath, and all of that. That itself has a fascinating history. He was also a physician. He was also drawing on the kind of medical tradition in Indian medical tradition. And so he was kind of synthesizing all of this. And his conception of the self sort of bridges the Aristotelian perspective on the one hand, and then the Sufi perspective on the other, especially when it comes to relationship between the form. In Aristotelianism, we talk about hylomorphism. Unlike Cartesian dualism, the self is a hylomorphic entity. Form and matter both are important. But Aristotle leaves unanswered many important details of that theory. So, Shah Waliullah has fascinating stuff to say about the relationship between the body and the mind and the form and matter through things like pneuma, animal spirit, aruh, al-hayawani, those kind of concepts. Yeah.
Fascinating. It's just so amazing how this this interest in this selfhood is so universal, right? It connects East and West. You have different scholars of different schools of thought reading this subject, coming to similar but different conclusions. But there's one thing that would link, I think, and coming to Iqbal as well, the famous Indian philosopher. All three, Mulla Sadra, Shah Waliullah, and Muhammad Iqbal, if I'm correct, please correct me here, all three would say that the self has to be purified, that the self has to be purged of certain attributes, that it's not recognizing the self it's still self. This is something evident. This is just a part of being a human being, or as Avicenna would say, a nafs nataqa, right? The intelligent or the rational being. That's not enough. Like, this is just such a basic concept. There's so much more about developing oneself, becoming as they say in today's terms, a better human being itself. But becoming a better human being is not in relation to oneself only, but in relation to one's journey to their end goal, which is, for them, would be God, right? The inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un part, the end part. And that's where I would assume for all three of them, this tahdhibun nafs and tazkiyatun nafs would be a central component on this whole journey. It's not just about the intellectual gymnastics to get there and conceptualizing. It's not necessarily a conceptualizing project, but a project of becoming.
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
From Avicenna, we could say from Avicenna to Muhammad Iqbal, maybe.
Oh, definitely, yes. That's why the normative and the descriptive, they're kind of intertwined.
Yeah.
And these questions are endlessly fascinating, because once in a while we do think about what, like, our problems, what worries us, the fact that we're not sometimes satisfied, we're working below our kind of potential. We can do so much more in life. We do think about it, we just don't have a clue how to get there or how to make ourselves better. So the self in these conceptions for these philosophers is seen as a kind of work in progress.
Amazing.
So life itself is seen as something like art of living. It's techne tobiu. It's a concept, goes back to the Greek art of living. So it's really fundamentally, it's about addressing the human question, because the ordinary situation in which we find ourselves in, it can never be kind of completely, it can never be the most satisfying situation, because sometimes we say to ourselves, especially in modern times, that you have to be true to yourself, you have to just accept yourself. But then these are very vague and ambiguous statements. They go back to the Enlightenment thinkers like Rousseau and others. Like, be original, be true to yourself. But which self? If that self has all of these negative thoughts, and desires that lead the self to all kinds of directions and ultimately fragmentation, then it's clearly not the win-win. It's not the desirable situation, regardless of our religious or whatever beliefs, right? So we do have to kind of weigh in on different factors, weigh in on kind of which option is kind of most suitable for me. But we cannot simply, at least in most cases, begin to continue to live our life in a way that and say to ourselves, we are being original. That's the way I am. That's, well, we can do so much better, because human potential implies so much more than our current state of, our current state of living. So that's where the concepts such as purification, purifying the soul, tazkiyat an-nafs, going back to the Quran, can be so useful. It's not like, there's just one methodology, one particular way to purify the nafs. There are many different ways, but fundamentally they are about, self-examination. They're about, taking into account things within our nafs, within our, what I call, human vulnerability, like things like negative emotions, like that's the obvious example, that kind of harm our relationship, destroy our relationship with others, and make our life kind of horrible at times. So we have to do something about it. And these philosophers, taking their inspiration from the Quran, and also continuing, in a way, commenting on the Quran, they are talking about how to get rid of, those factors, and return to a state of equilibrium, which is, in the terminology of the Quran, which would be nafsul mutma'inna, the tranquil self, the self at peace. And this is possible through meditative practices, spiritual exercises. And again, there's not just one way. There are many different ways one can think about it. But these things are not just abstract concepts, as we can see. They have real life kind of payoff. Yeah.
And we live in a world in which, or perhaps, I mean, I don't want to say we live in a world that was maybe different from the past entirely, but the world that I know is the one that's in front of me, the world in which today mental health is a crisis, right? This is a crisis, especially in the West. I've been looking at statistics about the use of SSRI, serotonin reuptake inhibitor. I don't remember what that means again, but basically the pills that people take to feel happy.
Yeah, dopamine as well.
Dopamine, I mean, the prescriptions are through the roof, these prescriptions, and the pharmaceutical industry has never been doing better financially. And there's this idea that, well, we can medicate our way through improving the self, right? The self has anxiety, the self has all these feelings, they can medicate their way, which brings us to modernity. I wanted to talk about Dr. Iqbal. So maybe we'll talk about Iqbal's, maybe tell us a little bit about Iqbal, because he was a lot more contemporary to us than Shah Waliullah and Mulla Sadra, and what was his contribution to this subject, especially in light of his historical context as well, and what he was dealing with, I think, just, if I'm not just, I guess, prior to this partition, right? Yeah.
Right. So before I comment on Iqbal, just a word on what you're saying, because that's so crucial, because all the statistics are showing the crisis of mental health, the increasing the high rates of suicide and all other forms of mental health issues. So at a time of anxiety and chaos, we are kind of frantically at times looking for kind of solutions, a way out. But then, if we're simply talking about, as you said, we simply feel there's kind of medicine, a solution for any of these problems, and it's just kind of some form of medicine. I think it's a very myopic conception, because all of these ideas focus on the self in terms of psychological well-being. And they think that life is, and the self is kind of confined to just psychology and our well-being. In a way, it's kind of a very selfish way of thinking about things. From a spiritual perspective, we talk about trials and tribulations. Sometimes trials and tribulations are what make us a better human being. People talk about post-traumatic growth, but that notion can only become meaningful if we, as you were saying, if we accept that there's an end, there's a goal to human becoming, and the journey continues beyond this life as well. So those factors are very important. But focusing on the self from a purely anthropocentric or individualistic perspective and trying to kind of cure it as if it's a machine, that's how we treat the self. We think it's, just it can be identified with the body and the brain, and it's all about different, medications. Actually, that's not leading us anywhere. It's only making things worse. And COVID is a prime example of that. And also, sociologists today are increasingly talking about post-society, because we have been accustomed to thinking of ourselves in terms of hyper-individualism, hyper-subjectivity, in a way that, we have become very isolated from, especially in the West. So in my book, although from one perspective, it might seem like I'm focusing on the individual, and religions, Quran always talks about the individual. I mean, not always, but a great deal of the Quran is about the individual. So the individual, in the sense of individuality in Islam, is not something negated. It's very important.
Yeah.
But what I'm proposing is an anthropocosmic understanding of the self whose identity is not located in the individual, whose identity is defined in relation to everything else in the cosmos. Because there's a verse in the Quran that talks about relationship between the nafs and ayah, God's signs on the horizon. Sanurihim ayatina, we shall show them our signs, fil wafaq, on the horizon, fi anfusihim, in themselves. So there's a deep connection between the self and the natural world. And when we forget that, when we think about ourselves, define ourselves in terms of individualism and treat the natural world as a resource, we actually make the situation worse, and climate change is a prime example of that. So it's very important that normative conceptions are not abstract. Our happiness, our well-being, if we're really serious about it, has to be defined, has to be thought of, reflected, not only from our own anthropocentric perspective, but the perspective of the entire world, entire universe, natural world, because that's how things are. There's the self and the cosmos are two sides of the same coin. That's why it's anthropocosmic. There's a deep relationship at the deepest level, between the being of human beings and the being of everything else, even though there are other psychological, physical differences, of course. So yeah, I just thought that's important. We shouldn't be thinking this is about anthropocentrism. But coming now to Iqbal
and his contribution to this discourse, yeah.
Yes. So Iqbal does talk a great deal about individualism and strengthening yourself, because he was arguing against Sufi pantheism. But some of these are kind of rather misunderstandings. And I have many articles published other long articles on Iqbal beyond the book. And so at times I'm actually very critical of Iqbal, because he was also, drawing on, well, I don't simply fault him because he was drawing on Nietzsche and others. That's not a problem for me. But it's a problem when it leads to subjectivism. So Iqbal makes sense to simplify, to summarize, because he has also important things to say about the nature of consciousness and other. But his notion of the self makes sense at a time of colonialism, when you need a strong notion of community and a strong self-understanding. Excuse me. So his notion of the self in terms of khudi, or self, that's a word that he uses mainly, is important. It's strengthening yourself, have a robust notion of the self. But the Sufis against whom he is supposedly arguing are not saying, oh, you just have to annihilate yourself through fana in the divine and get rid of all sorts of ego and self. Well, that's only one aspect of the Sufi understanding of the self. When the Sufis are talking about annihilating your ego and the self, that's the lower self. That's the problematic self, not the self in itself, the real self. So that distinction is so crucial. Iqbal is kind of taking on the straw man. So his arguments will only be valid if we have in mind the kind of problematic, the lower self, the self with all sorts of vulnerabilities, problems, etc. But that's not the ultimate notion of the self in Sufism. So that's why I think his critique against the Sufis and Islamic philosophers are sort of misdirected. nevertheless, he does make some contribution in light of his own context. Yeah, and he's not opposed to certain aspects of Sufism as well, like purification, like ultimately, the goal is to kind of know God, to kind of have some kind of deep relationship with God. He's not denying some of those things. So he is still a complex figure, because I'm not simply saying everything that he's saying is problematic. So it's only certain aspects of his philosophy.
Now let's conclude with with another subject, which I would actually love to invite you to discuss fully more later on, but at another time, which is, we live in this world. Every day I read about supercomputers and super AI and machine learning and automation, and it's everything. It's everywhere. You can't get away from it. I mean, you open the newspaper, that's what everyone is reading about. And I think Dennett, one of those philosophers I just read on the BBC, is warning civilization is at a crisis or something to this nature. We have to be careful. People have a lot to say about this. Clearly, you would work in this field of philosophy. Obviously, what I would really love to hear just briefly, a sketch of some of your ideas, and the notion of machine learning has such potential, especially when combined with quantum computing and supercomputers, that could really replace the need for human beings in some ways, or at least especially with Tesla and Elon Musk and all this other talk going on these days.
Yeah, so this is a really important topic, and really a topic for another day, because there's so many things you already mentioned. But I have a humble couple of articles about this topic already, and a number of talks that are already available. But I can summarize some of the perspectives that I've been proposing concerning this issue. So I myself personally use ChatGPT sometimes, and I'm not against technology, and it's thanks to technology we're having this conversation. And so you have to accept, but I don't accept the fact that technology is value neutral. It's never value neutral. It's, technology comes with what Heidegger calls enframing. I think the German word is Gestell, something like that. But technology kind of sees things in terms of resources. That's where I find things going wrong. But with AI, you have all of these people: Elon Musk, Ray Kurzweil, Nick Bostrom, whose center at Oxford has just recently been closed, and many others. There have been arguing about superintelligence. Even Jeffrey Hinton, who is a brilliant, one of the main architects of deep learning, originally from the retired from the University of Toronto. I think he retired. And so, yeah, this is something everyone is talking about. But if AI ever become conscious, then the next question is, what are the implications for human beings and human flourishing? And what are we supposed to do? What will be our role? Are we going to have a subordinate role? And if we have beliefs about afterlife, then how are those beliefs going to affect it? So there's a whole like spectrum of questions one has to address. And so I personally think that sometimes even the framing of the question, can AI ever become conscious, it stems from a fundamental misunderstanding about human nature. That's why it's so important to have, even if they're complicated, but people are making all of these generalizations, supposedly intelligent people. They're claiming that human being. Well, I was talking to an ordinary believer the other day. He was saying, "Oh, I don't understand a thing about AI, but when I go to mosque and I see the enthusiasm in people about this, I tell myself I at least know something about human nature. I know that fundamentally it cannot be machine-like. The whole claim of the AI is that it's going to be like human. It's going to achieve human-level intelligence." Now, just one point should be, so yeah, this is how I kind of explain in simple terms. So in terms of the normative conceptions, before we talk, in Islam, we talk about fitra, we talk about, purifying yourselves and achieving human flourishing. But here, due to this understanding of human beings in terms of machines, we are actually now thinking of trying to not thinking. Actually, we are actually remaking. We are trying to remake human nature, redefine human nature in terms of the computer. And I was surprised to see even someone like Jeffrey Hinton's, saying something like that. Like how we understand ourselves can be gleaned, can be understood from the way computer works. Can you imagine, like what we are at the deepest level, our deep inspirations and aspirations can be understood through the workings of a lifeless thing called machine. I mean, this is just even, yeah, it's something, it's so, yeah, it's, amazing that we come to a point where you take these things as self-evident premises, let alone question those premises. Like, what is consciousness? So when you go to the details of what is consciousness, and in my book, there are a lot of details also in other articles. Yeah, it becomes very clear why we can never have an AI which would be human-like, because human beings is so complex. Not, it's not defined by its computational intelligence alone. There is something called contemplative intelligence. We have something like moral wisdom, conscience. Sometimes we do things, we self-sacrifice. We sacrifice ourselves for the sake of a greater cause, and that it defies all calculations. And not to mention whether what AI is doing, it can really be called thinking, or whether when it comes to embodiment, the fact that AI, even quantum computers, these things work with semiconducting silicon or some other metal, they're ultimately not conscious and alive in the sense that we human beings are. Like we are not just disembodied consciousness, we are embodied, right? Body and mind, they're all intertwined. Computers can do amazing things, and and we have seen this again and again, but that does not necessarily make them humans. And it becomes clear when you reflect on the human situation as a whole, all the way from literature to philosophy to music to mathematics. We realize that, define it. So that's why, one of my conclusions is that we can never define human beings. Being a human is a journey. It's a process of self-discovery. It's a process of attaining something like cosmic consciousness, integrating one's family, friends, in the entire cosmos into one's perspective, one's consciousness, and transcending egoism, transcending nepotism, and kind of narrow nationalistic feelings and those things. Yeah, I think there itself you get an answer about the relationship between human beings and machine consciousness.
I appreciate it so much, and I think we would love to do a program in Toronto with you sometime on this, maybe with philosophy or something of that nature. We'll definitely look into that. Thank you so much, Dr. Faruque, for joining us today. And thanks to all our viewers for joining us, listening this far till the end. Visit our website, www.shiaresearch.ca. Visit our social media platforms and our YouTube channel for more content. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please consider contributing to the SRI to help drive more quality content in the future. And we hope you will join us for our next episode. Goodbye for now.
Thank you.